chasm opened without warning, a deep, jagged wound tearing across Kessel's Reach research camp at 3:47 hours, swallowing the equipment shed and the direct path to the extraction shuttle in less than 90 seconds of violent, grinding geological upheaval. By the time the tremors finally settled, field engineer Aisha Bello and the rest of the joint human Ythrenn survey team stood on the wrong side of a chasm, nearly 40 meters across, staring at their only extraction shuttle sitting undamaged and useless on the far side, while their sensor readings delivered considerably worse news than the visible damage alone suggested. Atmospheric venting detected from the newly exposed fault line, reported Chief Engineer Vale Asira, the Ythrenn survey team's senior technical officer, reading from a handheld scanner with the particular clip precision that Aisha had learned over 6 months of joint deployment, generally meant he was working very hard to keep alarm out of his voice. Sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide concentrations rising steadily from subsurface reservoirs disturbed by the seismic event. Current projection indicates lethal atmospheric concentration reaching this camp's position within approximately 6 hours. 6 hours, repeated Commander Liu Wen, the expedition's overall leader, her voice tight with the particular strain of someone doing rapid mental math on options that all seem to be narrowing toward the same unacceptable answer. And the shuttle's on the other side of a 40-meter gap we have no way to cross. Correct, Commander. I have already transmitted an emergency signal to Fleet Command requesting secondary rescue. Their nearest available transport is currently 31 hours out. 31 hours, Aisha said. We've got 6. Around them, the remaining 23 members of the survey team had begun gathering near the camp's central equipment cluster, drawn by the sound of the commotion, faces ranging from professional composure to poorly concealed alarm as word of the situation spread through the small camp. Aisha recognized the particular quality of silence that settled over a group in the earliest minutes of a genuine crisis, the moment before panic or purpose decided which direction the next several hours would take. Everyone listen up, Commander Wen called out, projecting her voice across the assembled crowd with practiced authority. We have a situation. I need calm, and I need your full attention while Chief Engineer Asira and Field Engineer Bello brief us on our options. Nobody panics, nobody wanders off. We solve this together, the way we've solved every other problem this expedition has thrown at us. The immediate silence that followed was, Aisha would later reflect, the particular kind of silence that settled over a room, or in this case an exposed rocky outcropping, when a group of highly trained professionals simultaneously arrived at the same grim arithmetic and found no comfortable way around it. We need to cross that gap, Aisha said finally, breaking the silence. 25 of us, 6 hours, and no working transport. That leaves building something to get us across. Vale Asira turned to her with an expression that carried, even filtered through the particular difficulty humans generally had reading Ythrenn facial structure, unmistakable skepticism. Field Engineer Bello, I appreciate the impulse toward problem solving, but I want to be clear about the engineering realities we're facing. A structurally sound crossing capable of supporting 25 personnel across a 40-meter gap requires certified load-bearing materials, precision fabrication, and structural analysis that our current equipment and timeframe simply do not allow. This is not a matter of insufficient effort. It is a matter of physical impossibility given our available resources. I don't think it's impossible, Aisha said. I think it's difficult, and I think we've got 6 hours to prove whether difficult and impossible are actually the same thing, because I don't see a better option on the table. What exactly are you proposing? Aisha glanced around the camp, taking stock of what remained accessible on their side of the chasm. Coils of heavy-duty cargo netting from the equipment shed's undamaged annex, several dozen meters of drone tether cable rated for considerably more tensile load than anyone had ever expected to actually need, a stack of aluminum scaffold poles left over from the camp's original construction, and crucially, an intact winch system still bolted to the camp's primary equipment mount. A suspension bridge, she said. Not fabricated, not certified, built from exactly what we've got sitting around this camp right now. I've built rope and cable bridges before, Chief Engineer, in considerably worse conditions than this with considerably less material to work with. It won't be pretty. It won't meet any certification standard your engineering corps has ever approved. But if the physics holds, and I believe it will, it'll get 25 people across that gap before your 6-hour window closes. Vale Asira's objection, when it came, was neither dismissive nor unkind, but carried the particular, careful weight of a man whose entire professional training had taught him to trust rigorous certification over improvised confidence. Field Engineer Bello, I do not doubt your experience or your intentions. I want to be direct about my concern, because I believe the stakes require directness rather than diplomatic hesitation. If we commit our remaining hours to constructing an uncertified crossing that ultimately fails, we will have spent the only resource we cannot recover, time, on an attempt that leaves us no better positioned than if we had simply awaited rescue and accepted whatever outcome that delay produces. I understand the risk, Aisha said. I'm not asking you to simply trust me blindly, Chief Engineer. I'm asking for the chance to show you the calculations and to let the people with relevant construction experience get to work while we're still debating, so we're not wasting the hours either way. Commander Ythrenn, who had been listening to the exchange with the particular focus of someone weighing two experts whose training and instincts had led them to genuinely different conclusions, finally spoke. Chief Engineer Osira, what's your alternative recommendation, given our time frame? I recommend we use our remaining hours to construct the most robust available shelter, sealed against the anticipated atmospheric venting, and attempt to survive the toxic exposure period using whatever filtration capacity our equipment can provide, until secondary rescue arrives in 31 hours. And what's your honest assessment of our survival odds under that plan? Veil Osira hesitated, a pause that told Aisha, more clearly than any direct answer could have, exactly how uncomfortable the honest number actually was. Our current filtration equipment was designed for short-duration atmospheric anomalies, Commander, not sustained exposure across a 31-hour gap. I would estimate survival probability under that plan at considerably less than 50% for the full team, depending on how quickly venting concentration increases beyond our initial projections. When absorbed that in silence for a moment, then turned to Aisha, and your bridge, what's your honest assessment of that? I've built structures like this before, Commander, under time pressure, with improvised materials. I can't give you a guaranteed number. What I can tell you is that the physics of a properly tensioned suspension structure doesn't require certified materials to work. It requires correct engineering principles applied to whatever load-bearing materials you actually have. I believe the cargo netting, cable, and scaffold poles we've got access to are more than sufficient to build something that holds, if we execute it correctly and don't cut corners on the tensioning work, however tempting that gets as the clock runs down. Ythrenn was quiet for a long moment, weighing a decision that Aisha understood, watching her, carried consequences neither engineer in front of her could fully guarantee either way. We build the bridge, she said finally. Chief Engineer, I want your team's full support on this effort, not reluctant cooperation. If Field Engineer Bello is wrong, we'll have lost time we needed for shelter construction. If she's right, we save considerably more than 50% of this team's survival odds. Given the numbers you've just given me, I think the gamble is worth taking. Word of the plan spread through the camp within minutes, and by the time Aisha finished her initial calculations, roughly 2/3 of the survey team had already gathered near the equipment shed, waiting for direction with the particular tense readiness of people who understood, without needing it explained further, exactly what was at stake in the hours ahead. Commander Ythrenn addressed them directly before construction began, standing on an overturned equipment case to be seen and heard by the full assembled group. I want to be honest with all of you. This plan carries genuine risk. Field Engineer Bello believes it will work, and I've decided to trust that assessment, but I won't pretend the outcome is guaranteed. What I can tell you is that our alternative, waiting here for secondary rescue, carries a survival probability our own chief engineer has assessed as considerably worse. I'm asking every one of you to give this effort everything you've got for the next 6 hours, because I believe it's genuinely our best chance of getting every single person on this expedition home safely. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered team, and within minutes, the camp had transformed from a shocked, uncertain crowd into a coordinated, purposeful workforce, decades of professional training across both species reasserting itself in the face of a crisis that offered no room for continued hesitation. Aisha felt something settle in her chest, watching the transformation, a familiar, grounding certainty that had carried her through disaster response work on 3 different worlds before this expedition had ever begun. Fear was still there, humming quietly beneath the surface of every decision she'd need to make in the coming hours, but it had, as it usually did once the actual work began, stopped being the loudest thing in the room. The 6 hours that followed were, by every account later compiled in the expedition's official incident report, among the most intensely coordinated engineering efforts any member of the joint survey team had ever participated in. Human and Ythrenn personnel working side by side across a rapidly narrowing window with a clarity of shared purpose that overrode whatever institutional skepticism had colored the initial planning discussion. Aisha organized the work with the practiced efficiency of someone who had, in a previous career doing humanitarian engineering work across disaster zones on Earth, built exactly this kind of improvised crossing more times than she generally liked discussing in casual conversation. She divided the team into 4 working groups. One anchoring the primary support cables using the camp's surviving structural mounts, one weaving the cargo netting into a continuous walking surface reinforced with the aluminum scaffold poles as cross-bracing, one managing the winch system that would provide the critical tension needed to keep the structure stable under load, and one, led personally by Vale Asira, once his own skepticism had given way to focused, methodical cooperation. Running continuous structural calculations to verify the bridge's projected load tolerance at each stage of construction. "I want to be transparent about something," Field Engineer Bello, Asira said, roughly 2 hours into the effort, reviewing a fresh set of tension calculations with visible, if reluctant, interest. "My initial assessment of impossibility was based on our standard engineering doctrine, which assumes certified materials and precision fabrication as baseline requirements for any load-bearing structure. Your approach appears to be achieving comparable structural integrity through a fundamentally different method, distributed tension, across multiple redundant cable paths, rather than relying on the kind of centralized structural certainty our own doctrine typically requires." "That's a pretty precise way of putting it," Aisha said, tying off another section of netting with quick, practiced hands. "Where I come from, we call it building a rope bridge. People have been doing it for thousands of years, long before anyone had access to certified materials or precision fabrication. Doesn't mean it's not real engineering. It just means the engineering happens in a different place, distributed through the structure and the technique, instead of concentrated in a single, perfectly manufactured component. I confess I am reconsidering several assumptions I have held throughout my career," Asira admitted. "I do not believe our engineering doctrine has adequately accounted for this category of solution." Nearby, 2 members of the netting team, a young human technician named Rafael Cortez and his Ythrenn counterpart, analyst Priyan Meshkal, worked in close coordination, weaving cargo netting into the walkway's growing surface with the kind of rapidly developing rhythm that came from 2 people learning to trust each other's hands in real time. "You've done this kind of work before?" Priyan asked, watching Raphael's quick, confident knotwork with evident interest. "Not exactly this," Raphael admitted, tying off another section and reaching for the next length of netting without breaking his pace. "Grew up on a fishing colony, though. Learned to mend nets before I learned to read properly. Different application, same basic principle. You're just trying to make something strong enough to hold weight, using material that's flexible enough to distribute stress instead of concentrating it in one place." That is a remarkably elegant description of tensile load distribution for someone claiming no formal engineering background. "I wouldn't call myself an engineer," Raphael said, with a small laugh despite the tension of the moment. "But growing up somewhere that depends on getting this kind of thing right, or people don't eat, teaches you the principles pretty fast, even if you never learn the fancy names for them." "I begin to suspect," Priyan said, tying off her own section with newly confident hands, "that this expedition has considerably underestimated the range of expertise your species considers ordinary." The work grew more urgent as the hours ticked down, sensor readings from the fault line showing atmospheric venting concentrations climbing steadily faster than the initial projections had suggested, cutting the team's available margin from 6 hours to, by the 4th hour of construction, a considerably tighter 4.5. "We're going to need to accelerate the final tensioning phase," Aisha said, reviewing the updated atmospheric data with visible tension of her own, the first real crack in her otherwise steady composure showing through as the true scope of the shrinking timeline became unavoidable. "I need every available hand on the winch teams. We're not going to have time for the gradual, careful load testing sequence I originally planned. That increases the risk of structural failure during initial crossing," Asira noted, though his tone carried none of his earlier skepticism, replaced now by focused, collaborative urgency. "I know I don't love it either, Chief Engineer, but I love the alternative a lot less. We accelerate, we test with minimal load first, and we adjust in real time if something's not holding the way it should. That's the plan we've got time for." The accelerated tensioning phase demanded a level of coordination that pushed every member of the team to the edge of their physical endurance. 4 separate winch stations, running simultaneously under Aisha's direct supervision, each one requiring precise, synchronized adjustment to avoid introducing uneven stress into the still developing structure. Winch 2 is showing resistance beyond projected parameters, called out Sanya Akafer, one of the camp's junior technicians, monitoring the second anchor point's tension readout with visible concern. I don't know if that's a genuine problem or just normal variance under this kind of load. Aisha crossed to the station in 3 quick strides, checking the readout herself with the practiced speed of someone who'd learned, across years of disaster response work, to make fast, confident judgment calls under exactly this kind of pressure. It's within tolerance, but only just. Ease off another quarter turn, slow and steady, and watch the cable for any visible fraying. If you see so much as a single strand starting to give, you call it out immediately. Understood. Understood. You're doing exactly the right thing asking, Sanya. I'd rather field 10 questions that turn out to be nothing than miss the one that actually matters. Keep watching that cable. The winch teams worked through the accelerated schedule with grim, focused determination, each station calling out tension readings at regular intervals, while Asira's calculation team cross-referenced the numbers against updated structural models, catching and correcting 2 separate load distribution errors in the final hour that might otherwise have gone unnoticed until the bridge was already under full crossing weight. Cross-brace tension on the eastern support is running slightly uneven, Asira called out, during one such correction, roughly 90 minutes before the projected atmospheric threshold. The load is favoring the northern cable path by a margin that will accumulate dangerously if left uncorrected across a full crossing sequence. I recommend redistributing approximately 8% of the tension load to the southern path before we proceed further. You heard him, Aisha called to the relevant winch team. 8% redistribution, southern path, nice and gradual. Chief Engineer, thank you. I wouldn't have caught that without your team's calculations running in parallel. It is, I confess, considerably more satisfying to apply my training towards solving this kind of problem than it was to spend the first hour of this crisis explaining why it could not be solved at all, Asira said, and Aisha caught, in the careful, precise phrasing, something that might, in a Ythrenn officer, have been the beginning of genuine enthusiasm. The final tensioning phase, compressed into little more than 40 minutes of frantic, coordinated effort, produced a structure that Aisha herself, examining it in the fading margin of their available time, privately acknowledged looked considerably rougher than anything she'd have signed off on under less desperate circumstances. A narrow, swaying walkway of woven cargo netting reinforced with scaffold pole cross-bracing, suspended across the 40-meter chasm by 4 primary cable lines anchored to the camp's surviving structural mounts, and tensioned by the winch system running at what Aisha privately hoped was well within its actual safety margin, despite the considerably less certain margin the bridge itself currently offered. I need someone to cross first, she said, addressing the assembled team with the same steady authority she'd carried throughout the entire 6-hour effort, though the strain of the accelerated timeline was audible now beneath it. Someone light enough to test the structure's basic integrity without risking a full load failure if something's not right. I'm not going to order anyone to do this. I'm asking for a volunteer. The volunteer who stepped forward, to Aisha's genuine surprise, was Vale Asira himself, the very engineer whose initial assessment had declared the entire structure a physical impossibility barely 5 hours earlier. I would like to cross first, he said, with a formality that didn't fully mask the visible nervousness beneath it. I have spent the last several hours verifying every structural calculation supporting this bridge. If my analysis is correct, I should be the one whose confidence is tested first, given that I am also the one who initially argued this attempt could not succeed. You don't have to prove anything to me, Chief Engineer, Aisha said. I'd rather have the lightest, most careful person crossing first, not the one trying to make a point. I am not attempting to make a point, Field Engineer Bello. I am attempting to honor the fact that I was wrong about what was possible here, and I find I would prefer to demonstrate that correction with my own steps rather than simply stating it verbally. Aisha studied him for a moment, then nodded, understanding in that particular exchange something about the weight of professional humility that transcended whatever species happened to be offering it. All right, slow, steady steps, stay centered on the walkway, and call out immediately if you feel any unusual give in the structure. We'll be monitoring the cable tension in real time from this end. Vale Asira's crossing, watched in tense, near-total silence by the assembled team, took nearly 6 minutes to complete 40 meters of swaying, unsteady walkway, each careful step drawing audible held breath from the group gathered at the near anchor point. The structure held, swaying under his weight in a manner that Aisha's trained eye recognized as normal suspension dynamics rather than any sign of structural failure, though she understood, watching the same sway from the perspective of someone actually walking across it, exactly why every observing eye remained fixed on the bridge until Asira's feet finally touched solid ground on the far side. Structural integrity confirmed, he called back across the chasm, his voice carrying something that might, in a Ythrenn officer normally so composed, have been read as genuine, unguarded relief. Field Engineer Bello, I believe your bridge is going to work. The full crossing that followed, 24 remaining personnel moving across the swaying, improvised structure in carefully spaced, weight-distributed groups over the following 90 minutes, unfolded with a tension that never fully eased, even as group after group, made it safely across, atmospheric sensor readings climbing steadily closer to the lethal threshold with every passing minute. Not every crossing went smoothly. Midway through the fourth group's passage, a young researcher named Deshaun Prentice, several steps onto the walkway, froze entirely, his hands locked around the guide cable, his breathing audibly ragged even from the near anchor point. I can't, he called back, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. I can't do this. I can't move. I'm sorry, I can't. Aisha was already moving before he finished the sentence, stepping onto the walkway herself despite every instinct telling her to preserve the bridge's remaining structural margin for the crossings still to come. Deshaun, look at me, not down, at me. She made her way carefully toward him, keeping her voice level and calm despite the ticking clock behind her. You're doing fine. Your body's just caught up with how strange this whole situation is, and it's decided this is a good moment to have an opinion about it. That's normal. It doesn't mean anything's wrong with the bridge. I can see the ground. I can see how far down it is. Then don't look at the ground. Look at me and then look at your own feet, one step at a time. That's the whole plan. Not the drop, not the distance, just the next step. She reached him, resting a steady hand against his shoulder. I've got you. We're going to walk this together, slow as you need. And I promise you, the person you're going to be on the other side of this bridge is going to be considerably prouder of themselves than the person standing here right now. It took nearly 4 minutes to walk the remaining 30 meters, Deshaun's steps shaky but steadily more confident as Aisha talked him through each one, and when his feet finally touched solid ground on the far side, he sat down heavily, hands still trembling, a mixture of relief and something like disbelief crossing his face. I did it, he said, mostly to himself. You did, Aisha confirmed, crouching beside him briefly before rising to return for the next group. Rest a minute if you need it. You earned that much, at least. Aisha crossed last, by her own insistence, remaining at the near anchor point to monitor the winch tension and cable integrity through every single crossing, before finally making her own careful passage across the structure. She designed and built in less than 6 hours, arriving on the far side with barely 20 minutes to spare before atmospheric sensors confirmed venting concentrations had reached the lethal threshold across the abandoned camp behind them. Commander Wen met her at the shuttle's boarding ramp, her expression carrying the particular exhausted relief of someone who had spent the last 6 hours watching a gamble she'd authorized play out in real time, with 25 lives riding on its outcome. You did it, she said simply. We did it, Aisha corrected, glancing back at the bridge still swaying gently across the chasm behind them, a structure that had, by any formal engineering certification either species possessed, no right to have worked as well as it had. I couldn't have built that in 6 hours without every single person who picked up a cable or tied off a knot. Especially not without Chief Engineer Asira's team running calculations the entire time, keeping us from cutting corners that would have actually mattered. Chief Engineer Vale Asira's formal incident report, filed with Ythrenn Fleet Command in the weeks following the Kessel's Reach evacuation, departed considerably from standard technical documentation format, including an extensive addendum that would, in the years that followed, become required reading for an entire generation of Ythrenn engineering cadets. I entered this engagement with absolute confidence in my own professional assessment, he wrote, an assessment built from decades of rigorous, certified engineering doctrine that I believed represented the full scope of what structurally sound construction required. I was wrong not because my training was flawed, but because it had never adequately accounted for an entire category of engineering solution, distributed, redundant, human-scale technique developed and refined not in laboratories or certification boards, but in centuries of necessity, disaster response, and hard-won practical experience. Field Engineer Bellows Bridge violated nearly every formal standard my own doctrine requires. It also saved 25 lives within a timeframe that made those formal standards entirely irrelevant to the actual problem in front of us. I recommend in the strongest terms available to me that Ythrenn engineering education incorporate formal study of human improvised construction technique, not as a curiosity, but as a legitimate, rigorously valuable engineering discipline in its own right. Aisha Bello, for her part, found the formal recognition that followed her report considerably less interesting than the quieter, more personal shift she noticed in her working relationship with Vale Asira over the following months of continued joint deployment, a professional partnership that had transformed, in the aftermath of Kessel's Reach, from cautious, occasionally skeptical cooperation into something considerably closer to genuine, mutual respect. The two of them were reassigned together to a joint survey mission 3 months later, a considerably calmer assignment cataloging mineral deposits on a stable, unremarkable world, and it was during a quiet evening at that camp, reviewing routine survey data, that Asira raised the subject again, unprompted. "I have been reflecting on something," he said, setting aside his own tablet. "In the days immediately following Kessel's Reach, I found myself troubled by a particular question, one I did not feel comfortable raising at the time, given the emotional weight of what we had just experienced together. I would like to raise it now, if you are willing to indulge me." "Go ahead." "You told me during the construction that people had been building structures of that kind for thousands of years, long before certified materials or precision fabrication existed. I have since done considerable research into human engineering history, and I find myself struck by something I did not expect. Your species did not develop your certified, formal engineering doctrine first, and improvised technique second, as some kind of primitive precursor later, refined into proper science. The improvised technique came first, refined over millennia of trial and necessity, and your formal doctrine was, in many respects, built afterward, as an attempt to formalize principles your species had already discovered through practical experience." "That sounds about right," Aisha said. "We've been building bridges a lot longer than we've had engineering degrees, Chief Engineer." "This troubles me in a manner I am still working to fully articulate," Asira continued. "My own species developed formal certification doctrine considerably earlier in our technological history as a foundational discipline rather than a later formalization. I have begun to wonder whether this early formalization, however valuable in many respects, may have foreclosed certain categories of practical improvised knowledge that your species continued developing in parallel with your formal science, simply because necessity never stopped requiring it of you." "I think that's probably true," Aisha said. "Doesn't mean your way is wrong for what it's worth. Certified engineering saved a lot more lives over the long run than improvised bridges ever will. I just think there's room for both, especially when the clock's running out and certified isn't an option anymore." "I keep thinking about what you said," Asira told her, months later, during a considerably less urgent joint survey mission on a considerably more stable world. "About the engineering happening in a different place, distributed through technique rather than concentrated in certified components. I have spent my entire career believing that rigor and certification were the same thing. I no longer believe that, and I find myself, at considerable professional cost to my own established assumptions, grateful for the correction." "I'm glad it stuck with you," Aisha said. "For what it's worth, Chief Engineer, I've learned plenty from your side too. That final tensioning calculation you ran, the one that caught the load distribution error before we finished the third support cable, I wouldn't have caught that in time on my own. Turns out the best engineering, on that chasm at least, happened exactly where it should have. Somewhere in between what either of us already knew going in." The bridge at Kessel's Reach was eventually dismantled by a proper recovery team weeks after the initial evacuation, its improvised cables and netting recovered, and at Vale Asira's specific formal request, preserved in the Ythrenn Engineering Institute's permanent collection, displayed alongside a placard that made no attempt to disguise the structure's rough, unglamorous, entirely uncertified construction. Deson Prentice, the young researcher whose mid-crossing panic had briefly threatened to derail the evacuation, requested and received a small fragment of the original cargo, netting as a personal keepsake, a gesture that struck several of his colleagues as unusual, until he explained his reasoning during a small farewell gathering held before the expedition's final dispersal. "I keep it where I can see it," he said, turning the small, frayed piece of netting over in his hands. Not to remind myself I was scared. Everybody already knows that part. I keep it to remind myself that being scared and still taking the next step aren't opposites. Aisha told me that, halfway across a swaying rope bridge with maybe an hour of breathable air left in the whole camp behind us. I don't think I've ever needed a lesson that badly, or gotten it from someone better qualified to teach it. The placard read, in both standard and formal Ythrenn script, a simple summary that Veil Asira had drafted personally, choosing his words with the same careful precision he'd once applied exclusively to structural load calculations. Built in 6 hours from cargo netting, scaffold poles, and salvaged cable, by 25 people who refused to accept that impossible and difficult were the same thing. It held, sometimes that is the only certification that actually matters.